Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Questions About Music. Questions About Music is the Colloquium series of the music department here at the University of Alberta. And as many series, we have series that run in different formats here in the department and more broadly in the Faculty of Arts. We have speakers, invited speakers. I'll introduce my guest in a moment. But something that we do differently is that we don't have formal paper presentations, but we rather have a conversation with the people that we invite so that we can engage in a different format with their work, with the sort of research that they've been doing. But in reality, this is a platform for not just for researchers, but also for performers, composers, people that, alumni of the university. And we try to engage with the different, multifaceted ways in which people engage with music in Edmonton, in and outside of the university. And this is our last episode for this term. We had a wonderful term of 3 guests. This is the last episode for 2025. We have beautiful things in plan for 2026 already. But if you have things that you'd like us to discuss or people that you'd like us to invite, don't hesitate to get in touch. There's always space for more planning, and we plan also a couple of years in advance, so don't hesitate. And it can really come from you and things that you care about, things that you're curious about that have to do with music in a variety of shapes and colors and possibilities. But today, my name is Fabio Morabito. I'm a musicologist here at the University of Alberta, and I'm joined by by our very own Brian Fauteux, who is a professor here of Popular Music and Media Studies in the Department of Music and Media Studies unit as well. And we wanted to invite Brian and talk about this beauty, which came out earlier this year in 2025, Music in Orbit, Satellite Radio in the Streaming Space Age, that came out for California as I was saying, March of this year. And Brian, as usual, for people that don't know, academic books, especially of this size, they take 10 years to do. So Brian has been working on this for quite some time, and it's a beautiful opportunity to hear from Brian about the research in this book, the research that led to this publication. And so, Brian, perhaps we could start by thinking, maybe I could start by asking about, so for people that don't know what satellite radio is, at the beginning when you introduce yourself to me and say like, hi, my name is Brian, I work also on satellite radio. I come from Europe and we don't have that kind of thing. So tell us kind of like what satellite radio is and especially where it is located, both in terms of geography and time, because something that people get pretty quickly by reading your book is this is also a very historically specific phenomenon. Satellite radio hasn't existed for centuries, and and it came out at a specific moment. So where and when and why?
Sure, great question. And part of, I guess, the longer history before I narrow in a little bit and answer your question actually, there's been a lot of instances of satellites bringing things to people more broadly, like TV. This was a mode that the Beatles used to bring concerts to people. Even in Europe, there was situations where you could dial numbers and order like cassette tapes or albums via like a satellite radio service for a while. So a lot of radio stations have been using satellite to bring things, broadcasts, live events more quickly to a wider group of people. But this Sirius and XM and then Sirius XM are what is called like S-STARS, Satellite Digital Audio Radio Service. And it's a distinct radio service by satellite that began in the US officially in the early 2000s with longer company histories in telecommunications and other things that kind of go back to the 90s. And then it expanded into Canada in 2005. Both companies merged at different times in both countries. And what was unique here was that it sort of comes at a time when in the US you had the Telecommunications Act of '96, and it allowed for more radio stations to be owned by fewer companies, and you had a lot of discourse in the radio industry talking about sameness, repetition, the sort of syndication of radio formats that didn't make the medium all that exciting, especially for music and thinking about variety.
So fewer people owning
more stations, right?
That's
and they could
you call it consolidation,
right? So you can take a format and have it in a bunch of cities, a bunch of regions. So these companies use that to market a new type of radio and played on things like enhanced sound quality, a wider variety of music streams, at a time when, I think there's a part there I indicate who was at the top of the Billboard charts in the early 2000s, and you had a lot of like genre diversity and types of artists like rock and hip hop and country. So there's a sense that taste was kind of like expanding. People had access to the internet, a wider variety of things. Broadcast radio, commercial broadcast radio wasn't reflecting that. So they tried to entice people, namely through the space of the vehicle, to subscribe to this new radio service that would give you access to a wider variety of channels, but also eventually to things like Eminem giving you a radio channel, Bob Dylan, all these kind of big tastemakers that they were able to acquire, which sort of set the gears in motion for a time now where you often see that, like, things like Spotify paying a bunch of money for Joe Rogan or for the rights to different sports broadcasts. This was an early instance of that taking place. So I think too, something about the vast geography of North America, something organized a lot around cars versus, in Europe, it's more the train typically or other means of transportation. World Space was another example of something similar that did exist. It covered regions of different Asian countries and African countries, and maybe part of Europe too. I'd have to refresh myself, but it went bankrupt in the early to mid 2000s, and it no longer exists. So this is the only sort of SDAR style radio by satellite that exists still today.
Yeah, and I think it's worth spelling out some of the differences with, let's call it terrestrial, or sometimes you call it terrestrial, sometimes you call it commercial
broadcast radio.
Yeah, and because you said that in North America people drive for a long time. If the signal is coming from the satellite, there is no interruption, right?
Usually, unless you get into mountains and buildings, and that's where they've also expanded through terrestrial transmitters, retransmitters.
Yeah, retransmitter. But the idea is that
you can drive forever and you can still listen to whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. Although there are retransmission kind of happening, but the point is also that it's the same. So it reaches, some of the publicity was coast to coast.
Yeah.
So people could listen to the same thing, whereas radio would be, broadcast radio would be tended to be more local.
Yeah.
So you could listen to the same thing. And the other big difference with broadcast radio would be that typically commercial broadcast is subsidized by advertising. Whereas this isn't. Would you like to explain a little bit what's the difference there?
So the difference, if you think about your typical commercial format radio, as you say, it's ad sponsored. That means it's usually tied quite rigidly to a certain format to give you a sense of who the audience is. So that company can say, we have these people, this age group, listening to this mix of pop music. We're not going to deviate from it. You have some sense of what you're getting when you buy ad space. This was an early instance, so when we're talking about maybe like the anticipation of streaming, it's also one of the first big examples of subscription access for listening, right? We all probably have so many subscriptions now. You probably borrow and share with family members or forget to check in on how many things you subscribe to and see your bill and think I need to cut some of that back. This was kind of the first instance of that taking place. And again, it would bring back those kind of values of coast-to-coast coverage, or they were using CD quality sound to entice people to subscribe and have something that would be ad-free, at least on the music channels. As their talk material has grown over the years, ads have become a bigger part of their revenue. So if you think about a lot of the popular podcasters, talk shows, sports talk shows, all that has ad revenue coming in. And there's been more of those channels added to the service in recent years.
Yeah.
Music is still ad-free.
Yeah, but so ad-free, but also to subscription instead of advertisement. But I think that one big difference that comes so clear in your book is that if you're doing that commercial broadcasting, you are speaking to a demographics or to a group that can be sold to specific advertiser for some advertisement. In this case, you're not bound to that.
No.
So you can have very niche stuff going on, niche channels, and people can just subscribe and then go on that niche or in a different one. Yeah. And since there is so much more geographical exposure, there are enough people that subscribe to access the, how many channels?
In the early days, they both had about 100, and now they've expanded via mostly a lot of online-only channels too. Yeah. But the bandwidth of the in-car service has expanded too.
So at the beginning, there was kind of like the rhetoric to, your book is a lot about like how can these companies were trying to turn listeners, radio listeners, into subscribers to make them see the value. One value is that you don't need to be the greatest, denominator and likes what other people like. You can have your, speak that directly to you in a kind of personalized way, because you can choose your own niche between these things without having to own something physically. Perhaps should we talk a little bit about the difference between subscription model and the model in which people would go and buy, records? You have this in the book at some point in which you say like that, someone that creates their own collection of music have kind of like this very clear agency in selecting. With the subscription, there is someone else doing that curatorship and selecting this. But what I was struck by is that the fact that you can go in such niche channels, and some are really, channels dedicated just to one decade of the 20th century, or not just subgenre, but micro-genres, kind of like, then you could have, that sense of ownership that you had with the material object of you going and buy it and being quite a personal relationship, sort of like is transformed in this subscription in which you can still go quite specific and see yourself in these micro genres, or maybe that's a stretch.
No, it's a huge part of it, and I think when we're thinking about the reasons to subscribe, the geographic range, the sound quality, but being able to tap into or find a sense of yourself and your music taste reflected on the channel lineup was a big part of that too. So it's an interesting mix when you think about some channels that are maybe around a certain band or artist. Maybe they're hosting on that, or maybe they're not. A lot of the channels now are for artists who have passed away, but the estate is still involved in programming that. The Bob Marley channel, for instance, has a number of his family members or children, relatives, who are still part of the ongoing circulation of cultural products tied to the Bob Marley world. But it's not just those big commercial superstars too. There's lots of jam bands. There's Grateful Dead, a Fish channel, a Jimmy Buffett channel, groups that would have fans in different parts of North America, which wouldn't make sense for an advertising sponsored radio station to say we're here in Milwaukee. Can we have just a jam band radio program? Probably not. But if you're taking those little communities from a bunch of different regions, you can do that, and you can serve those communities and have enough people tuning in, right? Yeah. So you kind of get those big superstars with numerous cultural products, and then those artists that have really devoted fan bases who might say, yeah, I will subscribe to that because it's an easy place to listen to this music, and I'm not going to bring my full record collection with me in the car, that sort of thing, right?
And the mobility is a big part.
It is, and it's kind of, again, before the turn to streaming, or even to being able to bring a ton of digital files with you. So this was an era where you were either listening to the radio probably, or maybe you had a CD player in the car. Maybe it was one of those ones in the trunk that allowed for 15 CDs. But otherwise, this was a way to have much more variety while you were on the go. And that gives you a sense of the type of subscriber they were after too, right? Somebody who can afford a car and afford a subscription, some sort of upwardly mobile, middle class to upper class ideal subscriber, at least in those early years. They've had to alter that a bit as they've competed with streaming services, but that was kind of the initial target demographic for this service.
Yeah, so I want to still go back to my first question. We answered the where and the when. Yeah. How about the why? Why this project? Like, why did you think it was important to write? You know, in a way, this is a very much a cultural history of satellite radio.
Yeah.
What brought you to that?
It's a great question, and it started with, before this, I was working on research around the Canadian campus radio sector and asking questions about how musicians get music out as we're kind of entering into the digital world. Thinking mostly at that time about more independent or community-minded modes of establishing networks for, you know, distributing music. And after that, you know, thinking, especially like here in Canada, we have Canadian content on the radio where you have to play a certain amount of Canadian music.
It's literally established.
It's literally established in policy. Even campus radio has that too. A lot of people are playing that anyways because you're usually playing local music. But I became curious about these new Canadian channels on the satellite radio services that were also in the US and what it meant for thinking about definitions of Canadian content as this service became licensed in Canada, and then what that meant for musicians and artists to have a new mode of entry into the American market, because thinking about the Canadian record industry over a number of years, that's always the challenge, right? You have a domestic record industry set up where you can, you know, test out bands, maybe reach a level of success in Canada via radio. Before that, you know, much music and music videos and touring. But to break into the much, much larger American market has always been the challenge. So when this was licensed, that problem figured heavily in policy debates, and it was seen by some, not everyone, a lot, you know, the commercial radio broadcasters were against licensing satellite radio, but some advocates of the Canadian music industry or artists saw this as like an interesting kind of pipeline into the US. So I wanted to study that and think not only about how and why it was regulated in the way it was, which was kind of seen as this imperfect thing because you get these channels that have to be there as a ratio to the overall package.
Yes.
But they're grouped together far down in the 100, so it's easy to sort of skip over those. There's lots of complaints about the bandwidth and the sound quality on the Canadian stations not being good.
Which is also uneven. You know, satellite seems this object from the above and with great quality, but then
it's
you're
still limited.
Still limited, yeah.
Aside from the online channels. So thinking more about the signal beamed into the car, they've had to, and I think they've admitted this in different you know, forms or you know, I found this in some documents, I can't remember where, but that some of the, you know, poppier channels or the ones lower down are given a bit more bandwidth than some of the maybe more niche ones higher up, or the Canadian ones for that matter.
Yeah.
I don't know if the Canadian one has been like officially proven, but if you listen to it, it's much worse. So curious about all those things, and then it sort of grew and expanded from there.
Let's talk for a moment about satellite and this object of wonder. So you already said how much this is tied to a specific moment in North American history, post Cold War, kind of like also, you know. But my impression is that the companies that were early in this business were really kind of like singing the song of this object high in the sky, or kind of like on frequencies that were kind of like objects that were actually higher than anything else. This fascination of, there was a beautiful passage in your book in which you talk about this object as something that we look up to, like the perspective of someone that looks at something above, which really reminded me of the concept of the sublime, of being below the threshold, which is an aesthetic category that has occupied, European aesthetician, philosopher, and thinking for, centuries about feeling little compared to something that is above. So, tell us a little bit how these companies were, in a way, characterizing or using the image of the satellite as something that should perhaps almost, I don't want to say supplant broadcast radio, but kind of like at least refresh it and bring in a new life to radio.
Yeah, I think like intentionally they probably were they were quite aggressive in going after commercial broadcast radio, and they had extensive ad campaigns and on actual billboards and in magazines like Rolling Stone or Billboard, calling out the limits of broadcast radio and pointing to this technology as being able to do something else. And there's lots of ads in the early days where records or instruments would kind of fall from the sky. Things in the press release of like kind of looking up at rocket launches. Even today we see, like, I talk a bit about this in the last chapter. A lot of the kind of billionaires behind tech companies now are like so fascinated with space and trying to like colonize space, like whether it's Richard Branson or Elon Musk. This is kind of kicking off that move from, the military use of this technology is still running throughout all of this. Something that really kicked off in the early 2000s after September 11th, of course, too.
Also the investments kind of like, in a way, needed to be justified.
For sure. Like all that had been done during the Cold War. So you get this real turn to communication satellites, but also thinking about things like surveillance and being able to kind of target in on people, thinking about that technology as, targeting these micro genres or types of listeners too. So it really plays into a lot of different facets of what's taking place here, whether it's regards to the actual organization of music programming or as a figure in the marketing and advertising of these services. But also, as you indicated in asking the question, thinking too about, and I talk a bit about this in the first chapter, I think it is, how outer space has often characterized music as like breaking out of genre or as being sort of exceptional, whether it's like space rock or groups like Outkast and Lil Wayne evoking alien figures to establish some sort of superiority as rappers. There's a long history of that sort of stuff too, right? Yeah. So thinking about something that's out there as characterizing this service as higher value, which then helps to deal with that problem of how do you turn somebody who is a radio listener, a free form of programming, to then subscribe. Yeah.
So I have one curiosity that just came up right now into my head. Did this aggressive advertising had a bad impact on broadcast radio that we know of?
I think that, like, to look directly at the influence of these services, I don't know if it was as significant as the turn to eventually streaming and digital downloads. I think you probably had a lot of people who were still doing both. Even if they did subscribe. And
because they couldn't get the local radio station.
There was that was like a point of policy. You couldn't cater locally and pull advertising dollars from local communities. So it would be more for listening to, nationwide things. But where was I going with this? Part of the story throughout this too, though, is kind of the inability or failure of commercial broadcast radio to do much different. HD radio and stuff was something that was kind of trying to come out around this time. It didn't really take off as something like new that people would buy. The problems of consolidation and ownership and sameness still continue to this day. So I think it's been more of, satellite radio is part of this progression of things competing with broadcast radio, but broadcast radio certainly hasn't gone anywhere.
Of course.
Due to predominantly that local focus.
Yeah, and I think you explain so well how this is a very culturally specific phenomenon. Because of course there are broader themes, that can be extrapolated, and there are it's relevant to do so, especially if we want to understand streaming platform today. Some things that started like subscription that started back then, and having to convert kind of like certain way of engaging with objects into having, you also quote Eric Droth at some point, the streaming capital.
The streaming book that came out not too long ago.
Yeah, exactly. That it talks about how there is this, with streaming platform, we sort of like, there is a shift in the way we do use value. We consider the use value of music because suddenly the streaming platform pays for the music, but the user pays for the service, And you describe it so well, both in general terms and also in more specific terms about how this is a phenomenon of the early 2000s. But there are certainly kind of like bigger themes across the book. And one is this. The very first sentence of the book reads, "Does the number one In music, it's a marker of success, popularity, and chart dominance. Propelled by radio and its cadre of influential hosts and DJs, a number one hit solidifies an artist's influence and relevance. Sometimes a number one reverberates across generations. At other times, it lingers for a week or two, a fleeting moment in time, still charged with cultural resonance. And then there are some beautiful questions that I'm going to read aloud because they're so good. Sure. How and why does a number one song generate value? And how do songs circulate and impart that value in our lives? How do media industries shape that circulatory negotiation and culture and community? So these are clearly, a way bigger question than just satellite radio, but perhaps we could, zooming a bit on this idea of the number one. Sure. And how that became in the specific case of satellite radio, a way to imparting value to the surface, using celebrities or a number one hit as part of the strategy for people to see value in the service and in themselves, perhaps, as a reflection.
Yeah, I think
as subscribers.
Would say two things to that, and good to know you at least read the first sentence.
I read much further on.
No, I was kidding. On the one hand, the thinking of like what a number one hit song is, and pulling back the curtain a bit and getting a sense that it's not just this equal playing field where songwriters are writing songs and putting it out there, and like we're deciding as listeners, like that's it, right? It's we know about payola and all sorts of things. So thinking about the ongoing relationship between the radio and record industry, and now more broadly, one thing I should have mentioned when describing SiriusXM at the beginning is that if you're not familiar with that company or that service, you've probably heard of Ticketmaster or Live Nation if you've bought tickets to anything. Liberty Media is the group that owns or has ownership stake in SiriusXM in like the mid 80%, and ownership stake in Live Nation and Ticketmaster, as well as Formula One, which is like something I'm kind of becoming curious on the side because it's becoming more culturally prominent, it seems, like in connections to celebrity culture. I feel like Liberty Media is behind that in some way. But, kind of looking behind the scenes to see what still matters in kind of the world of hit making, and what's the role of the radio and record industry into the streaming era to keep and propel these songs as hits, or to keep them in fashion in some way, and to avoid them sort of being lost. The other thing is that all of these, and this is in kind of talking to some people working in the satellite radio industry as well, is that these different channels or people working for the company have a different sense of like what a hit is, right? Yes. And it could be one of the decade channels which is actively pulling hit songs from radios past to circulate within like some sense of the 70s or 80s, this kind of like reconstruction or simulation of radios past. Or it might be a niche channel, like one of the heavy metal ones that has a very different idea of like what's a hit song within that. It's probably not something that charted, but the listeners would have some idea of what they'd want to hear and what makes sense as something in rotation, or kind of like, they do use that term orbit as well. I use that in a variety of ways, but one use of that by the radio industry is the time it takes for that song to come back on the playlist, right? And that's going to be different on different channels as well, whether it's more hit-driven or more about like a deep catalog.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about just an example of some of these legacy artists that have their own channel and the deep catalog sort of like exploration, since part of the problem and solution was to give a sense of exclusivity for the subscribers, for people to pay a subscription. So I'm fascinated by how there is a lot of new content production, so not just catalog, but also content, so in studio, playing, of song and interviews, the behind the scenes, interviews with these musicians. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? In the way, how is that different? Where else would people be able to access that? And how is satellite radio different in that sense?
Yeah, I think it's It's not. There's a lot of other examples that would be doing something similar. Like if you think of the station out of Seattle, KEXP, moving to do a lot of in-studio live performances with some interview material and have like YouTube as a platform where people are integrating with radio. That's sort of an example of this. What is kind of their college radio station, XMU, is one that often features that sort of in-studio stripped down acoustics session of somebody who's kind of out on tour with a new album that's kind of hidden behind the subscription in some ways. Sometimes they do post some of those songs on their YouTube channel or elsewhere too, but it's using that kind of like sense of intimacy that's part of that socially constructed genre of like, college radio music or indie music. They would do that more than maybe a station that doesn't need to do that, would. So the legacy or role of like genre and the imagined audiences that go with that, I think structure how they make use of things like exclusive sessions or in-studio sessions or interviews. But also, yeah, I think, does that answer your question?
It does,
yeah, okay.
But for me also, the difference probably is that in this case, you would have a 24/7 platform for it. Like, if you're a fan of, let's make an example, one of these superstar legacy artists.
Like, I guess there's the Beatles,
yes.
Taylor Swift.
Yeah, so you can just tune in on that channel and know that there's going to be content about that superstar 24/7. So, and have you spent time with one of these?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like, tell us more, like, what was the, of course, the orbit thing is a helpful metaphor. How often would stuff come back? If it's 24/7 about Taylor Swift or the Beatles, like, what was your experience of going through one of these channels?
I think like, it's different. And over the years, like, talking about doing this 10 years ago, when this started, there was much more of like a longer cycle. I feel like over the years, given the way this market has become more competitive, you do tend to get more repeats more often. Maybe not on every channel, but across the board, especially post-merger, that has been more common. So it really depends on what channel you're listening to and how often those songs kind of come back. I've spent a fair bit of time with the Tragically Hip channel. I listened to all the Bob Dylan theme time radio hours, which was really weird because he's very like rambly and odd in those, and it sort of messes with your brain a bit. And there's no real repeats in that, though. The idea is like, we're going to find something catered to a theme that is kind of from like, the Great American Songbook via him, or what, his understanding of what that might be in kind of like Bob Dylan's mind, versus some of the channels like the Decades one, you might get in a period of time something cycling through quite frequently, but then in 3 months it might be gone for a while. So it's like somebody is thinking through what's going through those channels for a period of time. You might get a higher frequency for a period of time, and then it might disappear for a while. So it really depends.
Yeah, I can see that. But I was fascinated as someone who likes EDM. You had a beautiful passage in the book about how EDM normally has not been taken up so much by normally broadcast radio, but actually you say that it would be out of step with broadcast radio, whereas in this kind of platform could be a lot of space could be made for it. And do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one thing that was, when you do some of these studies, sometimes it's like, on the one hand, you're pulling out things that are making you think like, okay, this has been a negative effect on like music culture. And then other things are like, okay, maybe there's been some good stuff here as well. And I think in the early days especially, these services were quite forward thinking with regards to like hip hop, EDM, even country music, playing way more from those genres than you would have had on, especially, I say commercial broadcast radio because like there's freeform radio, there's community radio, there's campus college radio, like other things are happening in that sector that might mirror what Sirius and XM are doing, or in many ways Sirius and XM kind of like repackage that for subscribers. But if you think about maybe DJ mixes or long tracks that are for dancing.
Yeah.
You can't cut to ads really on commercial broadcast radio. But if it's subscriber based, you could have a radio show that's just like, and there are often live DJ mixes on these channels of different DJs around the world who will have access to the audience and will have a certain period of time where they're doing on the air their DJ mixes.
Yeah.
And you could play that at like a party or drive around or
Yeah.
just like study or work out, whatever.
And the 24/7 thing and the coast to coast things means that also it doesn't matter where you are. So like in terms of time zone, that's no problem. Are there other radios that do the 24/7, or is more?
There's a lot of online radio that would do
radios,
that,
yeah.
and like you can access a lot of radio that way now through like smart speakers or apps or their streams.
So it's not such a unique thing of satellite radio, this 24/7 coast to coast.
No, you still have that. I think what's unique here is that you're kind of living in this world where you can easily jump across and to other channels that sort of, because there's very few people, I would imagine, who only want to listen to one of these channels. So you kind of have your collection or sense of where your taste falls, and you probably jump around. So I think what's unique is it makes that easy for you if you're on the go, especially, and don't want to do the work of tuning into something or jumping around or that kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah. Again, if you're in your car, doing online radio through the internet is less probably convenient as well.
It depends. I mean,
Depends, maybe.
it's definitely easier than it was in the past,
Yes.
but different from just having it built into the system and just doing it, right? You have to like press
Speaking
buttons
of
and
built
stuff.
into the system, we talked about cars and
of course.
how the automobile sort of like industry is really part. There's a beautiful sentence in your book, just like satellite radio would be nothing without the sort of the auto industry. Should we?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. If we go back to that question of how to get people to listen to this service, it was really the point of having factory installed radios and sort of having satellite radio as the third like band, AM, FM, and satellite radio. That's what really made it take off and initiate that subscriber system where you're given a free trial and they try to like keep you for as long as possible.
As a matter of fact, I got that when I bought my car here
there's
in
all sorts
Edmonton,
of
and I
ways.
didn't know what they were giving to me, like Sirius XM.
No. So like they want to try to find, say you did start listening to one of those EDM channels and you liked it, maybe you would keep doing it or think twice if they were able to say like, how about a cheaper monthly price and kind of hook you, right? Yeah. And everything does that now. It's really tough to, I think it was Amazon, it was leaked like 2 years ago that they used the term Iliad or Odyssey to refer to like the unsubscribe process because it's such like a complicated journey. You'll never like finish it. So like that's built into these companies, but it was that factory install that really allowed them to grow in subscribers, and then the initial signing of Howard Stern from broadcast radio really made them jump in subscribers too. Those were kind of like in the early years the two things that helped this take off. And before you'd have to go to the electronics store and buy this thing and put it on your car, and there's just too many steps for uptake across the board, right?
And their incentives probably, some of these...
like 6 months free and then maybe another 6 cheaper and then you...
No, but I'm also thinking about how much the two industries were kind of like giving money to each other to make sure that this would happen.
I think it was, I'd have to go back and triple check, but it was mostly, Sirius fronting the cost, Sirius or XM fronting the cost of those installations.
So giving it to Ford or General Motors.
They both acquire different companies. So if you bought X car, you might get Sirius. If you bought Y car, you might get XM. And now that they've merged, it can just be one for all of them.
But also because some of the reason to do so is because they had to have enough money before starting, because most of the revenue will be through subscription, right?
Oh yeah, even today it's still like considerably the most.
So before they started, they couldn't. And the cost to send the satellites in orbit, I was reading 900 millions, and that would be only for 15 years, and then they had to be replaced. A very significant upfront cost.
Yeah. And then the ongoing cost to pay the big talent you have on air too was becoming an issue, and still is. Like, it wasn't that long ago, I think it was in the summer, most people thought Howard Stern wouldn't come back, given just the cost of that contract. And he did end up signing, I think.
Can we say how much there was?
Well, initially it was $500 million for 5 years, and there's some stats there too that over the first 5 or 6 years of both companies, I think they had paid $80 million to the record industry, to musicians, and like one person was $500 million at that point. So you're already getting a sense of like, and that's part of the narrative of the story too, is how music initially was this valued thing that attracted subscribers, and then over time, it becomes more that like talk programming, that exclusive access to prominent voices that becomes valued, and they start talking about music as something that's ubiquitous and free, people can get it everywhere, so we shouldn't be paying so much to musicians, right? That's kind of in the policy-making, copyright dealings behind the scenes, royalty payment behind the scenes, where music starts to become strategically devalued for the purpose. Not that it actually is, those music channels are still probably, they are still some of the most listened to ones for sure, but they use that as a tactic to continually try and keep royalty payments as low as possible.
And I think you do a really good job in the book to talk about perceived value, and so how this strategic devaluing it makes sense to pay less, and kind of like the perceived value of the subscription through these legacy artists and the exclusivity of getting something much higher quality and from something high above you. But one sentence that stuck with me in your book is how you say at some points subscription models are known not to manage to adequately sort of like compense artists for their work. Maybe can we comment on the darker side of...
I think one interesting aspect of this service though is that at the same time that in dealings with the Copyright Royalty Board, they're trying to keep those royalties low, it's also becoming one of the biggest royalty payout systems for musicians, given that it was, at least up until pretty soon in the future, this is changing. They're starting to be treated more like a Spotify, whereas before they were treated more like kind of like a radio royalty payment, but even better because Sound Exchange started paying performance royalties, which doesn't happen on broadcast radio in the US. So the average payout, a few years ago was $50, $60 for getting played, getting a song played on satellite radio, which is millions more than what a Spotify stream or something is, and that's because they're imagining this one play hitting all these people in the satellite's like footprints, listening potentially at one moment, versus like a one-to-one stream on your Spotify. So you have this kind of like tension between it being kind of lucrative and talking to some musicians over the years too, them thinking about the most important person in the room at a performance in Toronto was like the Sirius XM Canada person, because if you get entered into those Canadian channels, the royalty payments are so big at a time where like you're not really getting royalties from Spotify or Apple Music in the same way, but still trying to keep those payments as low as possible. They had a big copyright court case for not paying royalties pre-1972 for a period of time. So if you're the 60s on 6 channel, nothing's really going to anybody from all of that music, right? So you have this kind of like power being thrown around to try to keep those payments low. But at the same time, given how bad the entire music ecosystem is, it's still it's been one of the better ones.
Wow,
yeah.
Incredible. I had not realized that, yes. We're about kind of like, about to open the questions to the floor. But maybe, before we do so, I just want to ask one last thing about orbits and how much, this is, as you said, is a image and a metaphor that you use in so many different ways in the book. Which one is your favorite one?
I think it's probably like the sense of songs coming back around, and like the one that gives me the most questions now, and even thinking about things I'm starting to move into now, is just thinking about the hows and whys of something coming back from the past and being, recirculated. I think the chapter 3 that talks a lot about the role of like nostalgia and getting into some different theories about like simulation and postmodernism and what have you. Like, yeah, that is probably my favorite one. And just thinking about even now where it seems like, you know, we're kind of at the end of the year now and talking with friends or different collections of people in like group chats or other things. You do your rundown of like what were the top albums of this year, and I feel like I can't even remember what any of them were last year, and it's just like things come and go so fast now, but also stuff from the past kind of comes back and kicks around for a little while, and why that is and what the role of media industries are in that now, whether it's like TikTok or satellite radio or a big biopic, which usually brings something back into like we're going to be hearing the Beatles for a while because of those 4 biopics or 5 biopics that are coming out. And they have a Sirius XM channel, and that kind of happened after they opened up and licensed their music more widely. So that's probably my favorite one.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I think it's a wonderful, you know, thing to finish on, because as much as it's packaged as this brand new technology in the early 2000s of radio that supersedes broadcast radio, there's so much emphasis on the past and legacies and people. There was your interviews with one of the directors, the former directors. This is like, people, you know, become the music people that they are between 16 and 20, and then they continue to listen to that music.
And we want to have a channel for all of those people. And everyone has a channel
for the people for the decade in which they were between 16 and 20, you know. And so there's so much future and past in the same package in a way. But questions from the audience. Go for it. Yes.
Hi, thank you. So I had a sort. You began to talk about this, but I had a follow-up question. The question of DJs, not in terms of EDM, but in terms of like you know, having their own show.
Yeah.
And at least this is like a little bit before my time, but I have this idea of this sort of legendary past where there were sort of like local DJs who, you know, were playing a certain kind of music, certain genre, certain bands, but it was really their show. And I'm wondering, does that translate to satellite? Does it get lost? Does it transform into something else?
It's a great question, and I think, you know, it's become a mix, and there are some DJs and the shows that they kind of became known for, branded, who made the move over and carried that with them. So you might know within like the 60s channel, or even now like the Beatles channel, they'll have these influential people that will have a couple hours a week to still do that. And then others who came from the broadcast industry or from like MTV, and they will be more of the regular DJs that you listen to and tune into. And it really depends on, like, over time, they've also tried to reduce costs by maybe firing DJs on certain channels, and there's been more pushback, as kind of Fabio was mentioning, like these channels for people who came of age at certain moments. If like the 90s channel for a period removed DJs, but that kind of like Gen X listenership really values that voice and presence, and there was a lot of uproar and they put them back. And then you have people that maybe have a show for a period of time and it's gone, that would have that kind of like personality that you mentioned. And touring, I haven't seen, they wouldn't let me see the New York studios, but I saw the Washington, D.C. ones, and it very much has that feel still, like lots of cubicles filled with records thrown around and stickers, and a lot of that has been recontextualized for this world, and that like legacy of the radio industry still does permeate a lot of what takes place. Yeah, thanks. Those questions, right?
Yes, please.
Over a year ago, Spotify released a AI DJ that like made music for people and had its own radio station, and I kind of wanted to know, where do you see the future of broadcast radio going from there? And like, do you think that AI is something that radio stations would try to use more? Or what kind of technology do you think broadcast radio could keep in to keep its place relevant in music?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I don't, you know, I have lots of pessimistic thoughts. I have more like realistic thoughts. And, you know, I could say a lot of things. I feel like a lot of what's being tested now is trying to answer that question you're bringing to the table. Is we, like from a company perspective, Spotify perspective, thinking, here's this thing we could try out. Will it work? Will people want to use it? Will they want to incorporated into how they organize music. And I'm not sure, like my sense would be that some sort of like AI voice DJ thing won't last. Like the role of something pretending to be a DJ won't. The technology will still be there in giving you some sort of like music mix, a playlist. But I think there will still be, like radio has been around for so long, it's faced television and streaming. The kind of local voice of a person keeping you company, that will remain part of the medium. There'll be lots of ways that, I mean, there's like a long history of automation. I just read a colleague of mine that's written some great articles on early automation in radio. There's a long history there of stuff that's like, kind of like AI now. It's some of the DJs that went to SiriusXM did so because of automation and removing on-air voices with the Jack FM format, decades ago. So in many ways, a lot of this isn't new, and we've seen a lot of waves of, the tech industry or various industries trying to kind of force stuff on us, and it gets worked out in culture what sticks around. And I think we're in that moment right now with a lot of this where these companies are forcing a lot of stuff on us, and we're still figuring out what's going to stick around, what's going to be seen as like cheesy or bad or not wanted, and what the future will look like. I think will really depend on the choices we make and the things that we value and appreciate and have an interest in. So that long history of automation will continue, no doubt. But I still think there's going to be that desire for some connection to voices and personalities, especially in local settings. And it'll be some mix of things, right? You can listen to your playlist on Spotify and maybe tune into a voice. It may be local, it might be somebody else. Like look at the rise of talk and podcasts over the last little while too. Like people want that connection and that voice for better or worse. So I hope that answers your question, but it's a good one. Jason.
I must admit, I felt a bit nostalgic for the car when you were talking about how streaming makes time and place become less important and less apparent. Because, I mean, I drive a very old car that still has a cassette tape as part of its kit. And I think about driving from place to place, usually at night maybe, at a time when, one radio station fades out and you're trying to find the next one. And you're moving to another place and you hear what they're listening to. There's happenstance that's part of that. There's an understanding of time that's part of that, and also the place, like country stations in Wyoming or Alberta, etc. So, is there any way that has been replicated, either intentionally in streaming services? Like, is it a different vibe at night, like in night hours or in the day hours, or have you ever found happenstance there at all?
I mean, I think as I've gotten older, I've been drawn more back to things like radio and stuff because of what you're explaining. Like I'm getting kind of like to a grumpy point where I don't even like pre-recorded radio on the radio. Like CBC Music does a lot of that now, and I want to hear something that's happening at the same time that I'm tuned in. That's what I really am drawn to now. And I don't listen to a lot of streaming for that reason unless I'm walking or, I want something in the background that is predictable while I'm marking or something without voices. Because I don't think it has that unless you really organize playlists for different moments and moods and you tune into that, or you use their channels that are maybe about a campfire at night or tea in the living room, and that might be okay, but I think it doesn't, or at least I've found it doesn't always mesh with what I'm feeling or what I am after versus, and I could be thinking about radio shows all around the world versus like ones that are put together by people or stations that have kind of an overarching sense of how they organize music, and you find those and stick with them. So I don't think that has really become as much of a part of streaming. It's part of how they do organize playlists and the algorithm in certain contexts, but it's something I personally find lacking, but I also am a bit older than people who maybe came up through streaming services being first and foremost the tool for listening to music. And people younger than me would probably have a very different relationship to what you're getting at, and maybe have found ways of, happenstance or reflecting mood or moments in ways that I've personally found unsatisfying. But I don't think my personal experience it can be applied broadly. But I think SiriusXM's relative success has been that there is still some sense of wanting those voices and like timed listening and the things that you're kind of getting at, right?
So between your first book, Music in Range, and your second, Music in Orbit, you seem like you're a music in range type of guy. You're music in rap.
But also I do like to find these things like from other parts of the world and stuff too that give me that sense, right? Like I do mostly listen to local radio at home and between CJSR and CKUA. Like very lucky to be here in Edmonton where there's two great kind of local stations that are listener supported and give me what I'm personally after, and I never really put streaming music on at home. It's more of a mobile thing. But sometimes I will tune into other radio stations through TuneIn from different parts of the world too, and I really like that as well. So I'm between the both a bit. Yeah. Thanks.
Your conversation about the bandwidth allocation
Yeah.
got me thinking about, earlier there used to be this whole thing of you pick your niche and you kind of have that sort of culture around whatever's your thing is your thing. And I think about, now when streaming platforms have become the norm, we're all kind of being pushed towards maybe the more mass appealing things that are easier to sell. And do you think that that's kind of leaking into radio culture a little bit more, where you're kind of being pushed more towards what's popular rather than pushing maybe your own niche and whatever's your genre or your subgenre and whatnot? Do you think that streaming cultures have that effect on it?
I think that that's a really interesting question, and I think there's different models in different broadcast contexts. I'm trying to think of which way to go in this with this answer. I think there's been something taking place, probably about 10 plus years backwards, where there's a type of song that, plays well on radio and in streaming numbers that you tend to hear a lot now. Kind of like, genres have always been hybrid to some extent, but you get a lot of songs now that kind of just seem to be, I don't know, like there's more of a texture to it than a genre perhaps. And I think that that's part of what you're getting at. At the same time, one interesting trajectory of SiriusXM is like trying to get out before streaming and before radio to break artists and sort of establish what a hit might be and see what would take off. So I think, there's lots going on, but I think, does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, sorry.
One?
I was kind of like, I was thinking kind of along with Julia's question too about the two books, how the way the two titles kind of reflect each other with Music in Range and Music in Orbit. I guess I was wondering about how they're both radio books, but like hyper planetary and then super, super local. What was the difference kind of in the research process? Like what was your actual day-to-day experience of researching two similar and different?
Yeah, very different. The first one, in something like a campus radio sector, everyone wants to talk to you, and it's hard to like get them to stop. And everyone has like a sense of why these stations matter. So I think in that case, it was easy to have access. It was tough to find historical information, like a lot of people scanning and sending me stuff, or like, oh, we did find this like box of documents, or the CRTC license kind of documents that we had to submit. And it was really fun to track that down, and it felt more like a scavenger hunt, but with a lot of access.
Corporations.
Yeah, a lot of access to people. But you had to also like temper those narratives, or like, deal with those narratives and just realize like somebody's own personal relationship to this thing that matters so much may not be the whole story. Whereas in this, often I would reach out to people who worked for the company or who were a DJ, and they'd be like, yeah, I'd love to talk. And then I'd get an email 2 days later, like, sorry, I can't. It's like they would ask about it and be shut down. So there was very few people to talk to, and it was more combing through the trade press and annual reports and trying to piece together the story in that way. So it was much more reading and organizing and kind of building a narrative from documents. Whereas in the past with the campus radio, it was more about like visiting stations and talking to people and seeing what I can find and piece together.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I thought that in your introduction you make such a good showcase of the process of this research, so people read the introduction at the very least. It's also a wonderful blueprint to see how someone has done work, with corporations and the kind of sources that you've used and where they appear. So join me in thanking Brian for this conversation.
The questions.
And please join us for the wine reception.
Thanks, great questions.
Yeah, no, great.